The day they moved my fence 6 feet was the day they lost everything. The smell of fresh-cut grass hit me before I even stepped off the porch, sharp and green, mixed with something colder, something wrong. I remember the sound next, the low metallic hum of machinery idling where there shouldn't have been anything at all. My boots crunched against gravel as I walked toward the edge of my property, the early Texas sun just starting to burn through the morning haze. And then I saw it. My fence, my father's fence, was gone from where it had stood for 23 years. Not destroyed, not broken, just moved. 6 feet inward, like someone had taken a ruler to my life and decided I didn't need that strip of land anymore. The posts were still straight, the cedar boards still lined up clean, but the earth around them was fresh, raw, disturbed. Whoever did it hadn't tried to hide anything. They wanted me to see it. I knelt down, pressed my fingers into the dirt where the original post holes used to be. Still soft, still damp. This had happened hours ago, maybe less. The scent of turned soil clung to my hands as I stood back up, scanning the property line. That's when I noticed the stakes. Bright orange survey flags, planted in a perfectly straight line, cutting across what used to be my land like it belonged to someone else now. My jaw tightened. I didn't need a map to know what I was looking at. I'd spent 15 years working infrastructure contracts across 3 states. I knew what official looked like. And this was someone pretending to be official. A truck door slammed somewhere to my right. I turned just in time to see a white Lexus SUV parked near the access road, its paint catching the sunlight like it owned the place. Standing beside it was Rebecca Shaw. Perfect hair, pressed blazer, clipboard tucked under her arm like it was a badge of authority. She smiled when she saw me. Not surprised, not nervous, just satisfied. "Morning, Ethan," she called out, her voice smooth, practiced, like she'd already rehearsed this moment. We went ahead and corrected the boundary line. It was out of compliance with community standards. Community standards. I let that sit in the air between us. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of asphalt from somewhere beyond the trees. I followed it with my eyes and felt something colder settle in my chest. Past the new line of my fence, crews were setting forms. Wooden frames. Measuring tape stretched tight. Spray paint marking curves in the dirt. They weren't just moving a fence. They were building something. "You moved my property line," I said, keeping my voice level. Rebecca tilted her head slightly, like she was humoring a misunderstanding. "No," she replied, tapping her clipboard lightly. "We adjusted the visual boundary to match the planned entrance expansion. It benefits everyone." Planned entrance. I looked again, really looked this time. The stakes, the measurements, the angle of the cleared land. They were carving out space for a new subdivision entrance. Wide, polished, designed to impress anyone driving in. And they decided to take 6 feet of my land to do it. Just 6 feet. Like it didn't matter. Like I wouldn't notice. Like I wouldn't care. I wiped my hands on my jeans, leaving streaks of dark soil behind. The fence stood there, quiet and obedient, pretending it had always been in this new position. But I knew better. Every inch of this land had a memory. Every post had a reason. And now someone thought they could rewrite that with a clipboard and a construction crew. Rebecca was still watching me, waiting for a reaction, maybe expecting me to argue, to get loud, to play exactly the role she'd already decided I would. Instead, I just nodded once, slow and deliberate, and looked past her toward the half-formed outline of what they were building. Because what she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that you don't touch a man's boundary unless you're ready to prove where it actually is. I took one last look at the shifted fence, then at the line of stakes cutting across my land, and finally at the beginning of their new entrance taking shape in the distance. That's when I realized exactly where this was going to end. And it wasn't where they thought it would. I brushed the dirt from my palms and started walking back toward the house, already replaying every detail I'd just seen, every measurement, every angle, every mistake they didn't know they'd made. Because 6 feet isn't much until you measure it the right way. I built my life around straight lines and measured edges long before anyone in that neighborhood ever heard the word HOA, and that piece of land out there was no exception. My name is Ethan Caldwell, 38 years old, licensed contractor, infrastructure specialist, and the 3rd generation to stand on that exact stretch of Texas dirt. My grandfather bought those 10 acres in 1962 when this place was nothing but open pasture, and a gravel road that turned to mud every time it rained. He did not see it as an investment. He saw it as something you could hold on to, something that did not shift depending on who had more paperwork or louder opinions. My father grew up here, learned how to work with his hands here, and when he was old enough, he built that fence himself. Not hired out, not rushed. Every post dug with a manual auger, every board measured twice, cut once, leveled with a string line stretched tight between corners that he marked himself. I still remember the smell of cedar the summer we replaced a section together, the heat rising off the dirt, sweat running into my eyes while he corrected my measurements by a fraction of an inch like it mattered more than anything else in the world. Because to him, it did. Boundaries were not just lines on paper. They were promises. When he passed, that land came to me, not because I needed it, but because I understood it. I had spent years working large-scale infrastructure projects, highways, drainage systems, commercial developments where millions of dollars depended on getting a line right down to the inch. I had seen what happened when people ignored boundaries, when shortcuts were taken, when assumptions replaced documentation. It never ended well. That is why when I bought out my sister's share and made the property mine outright, I did not change much. I reinforced the fence, replaced what needed replacing, and left everything else exactly where it belonged. I was not interested in turning it into something flashy or profitable. I wanted it quiet, predictable, mine. The neighborhood that grew up around me did not share that mindset. Willow Ridge Estates started as a handful of identical houses and quickly expanded into something bigger, something louder. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, decorative streetlights that hummed faintly at night. And at the center of it all, the HOA. Rules stacked on rules, committees for everything, and a leadership structure that made people feel important without ever having to build anything real. I stayed outside of it as much as I could. My property sat just along their boundary, technically independent, legally separate, and that distinction mattered. Or at least it used to. The first time Rebecca Shaw introduced herself, she stood at the edge of my driveway with that same clipboard, the same polished tone, explaining how the community was expanding and how cooperation would benefit everyone. I remember the smell of her perfume cutting through the dust in the air, something expensive trying too hard to feel natural. I kept the conversation short. I told her I respected their space as long as they respected mine. She smiled like that was a temporary position, like I just needed time to understand how things work now. Over the next year, I watched as their development crept closer. Trees cleared, roads widened, survey crews appearing and disappearing like they were mapping out a future that did not include me. Every time I saw those orange flags, I made a point to check my own markers, to walk my fence line, to remind myself that nothing had changed. Because legally, it had not. My deeds were clear. My boundaries documented. My land was mine. That is what made that morning different. It was not just the fence being moved. It was the assumption behind it. The quiet confidence that no one would challenge it, that a few feet here and there could be adjusted without consequence. I could still feel the grit of that disturbed soil on my palms as I stepped back inside the house, the screen door creaking behind me, the familiar hum of the refrigerator grounding me in something stable. I walked straight to the drawer where I kept my documents, not in a rush, not angry, just focused. Papers slid across the kitchen table one by one, surveys, permits, old maps that carried more weight than any clipboard ever could. Outside, I could hear the distant rhythm of construction continuing like nothing had happened, like that line had always been where they put it. I leaned over the table, tracing the original boundary with my finger, following it from one corner to the next, feeling the precision of it, the certainty. Because if there was one thing I trusted more than anyone's explanation, it was the line itself. And something about the way they had drawn theirs did not add up. I had met people like Rebecca Shaw before, but never someone who wore control the way she did, like it was tailored to her. She did not raise her voice, did not make threats, did not need to. Everything about her said the same thing without saying it directly, that she was used to being listened to, used to being right, and used to people stepping aside before she ever had to push. The first time she walked the boundary line with me months ago, she had worn heels that sank slightly into the dirt with every step, but she never seemed to notice. She pointed at things that did not belong to her, spoke about future improvements like they were already approved, already funded, already inevitable. I remember the faint clicking of her pen against the clipboard, a quiet rhythm that matched the way she talked, controlled, deliberate, practiced. "We are planning a more cohesive entrance experience for the community," she had said back then, gesturing toward the stretch of land that now had orange flags running through it. Something that reflects the value of the neighborhood. I had followed her gaze without responding, watching a hawk circle above the tree-line, listening to the wind move through the grass. "That entrance does not involve my property," I told her. She smiled in that same way she did this morning, like she was looking at a problem that would solve itself eventually. "Everything involves alignment, Ethan. Sometimes it just takes time for people to see the bigger picture." That was the first moment I realized she did not see lines the way I did. To her, boundaries were flexible, negotiable, something that could be adjusted if the outcome justified it. And she had built an entire system around that belief. The HOA meetings were proof of it. I had attended one, just once, sitting in the back of a room filled with identical chairs and the low murmur of people discussing landscaping rules like they were federal law. Rebecca stood at the front, confident, composed, flipping through printed plans mounted on foam boards. There were diagrams of roads, lighting fixtures, entry signage, and at the center of it all, a redesigned entrance that curved wider than the current road allowed. Even from the back of the room, I could see it. The curve cut across where my property line sat, shaving off just enough to make the design work. Nobody questioned it. Nobody asked whose land that was. They only talked about how nice it would look, how it would raise property values, how it would make the neighborhood feel more complete. I remember the smell of coffee and printer ink in that room, the soft hum of an overhead projector, the quiet approval in people's voices. When the meeting ended, Rebecca approached me again, already knowing exactly who I was. "I am glad you came," she said, handing me a copy of the plans. The paper was smooth, still warm from the printer. I glanced at the layout, my eyes tracing the curve of that entrance, the way it intersected with my boundary. "This does not match the recorded survey," I said, tapping the edge where the line shifted. She did not even look down. "Those details are being reviewed," she replied. "Our development team is working closely with city planning to ensure everything is compliant." City planning. That explained the confidence. I had heard the name before. Her husband, Daniel Shaw, worked in the county office. Not a high-profile position, but high enough to know which approvals moved faster and which questions never got asked. It was not corruption in the obvious sense. It was quieter than that. A familiarity with the system that made it easier to bend without breaking. Over time, I noticed how that confidence spread. Contractors showed up on their schedule, not mine. Survey markers appeared closer and closer to my fence. Notices were mailed out to residents about improvements that had not technically been approved yet. It all moved forward with the assumption that it would eventually be justified. That is how people like Rebecca operated. They did not wait for permission. They created a version of reality where permission felt unnecessary. Standing there in my kitchen, looking down at my own documents, I could see the difference clearly. My lines were fixed, recorded, backed by decades of paperwork and physical markers that had not moved since they were first placed. Her lines existed on printed plans and conversations, reinforced by confidence and the absence of resistance. And this morning, she had taken the next step. She had made her version of the boundary real, at least. On the surface, the fence had been moved. The stakes had been placed. The construction had begun. To anyone driving by, it would look official. It would look settled. But I had spent too many years watching projects fall apart because someone assumed the ground beneath them was solid when it was not. I picked up the survey map again, holding it closer to the light, tracing the coordinates, the angles, the exact measurements that defined what was mine. There was no ambiguity here. No room for interpretation. Just numbers, distances, and fixed points that did not change because someone wanted them to. Outside, the sound of machinery shifted, a deeper rumble this time, like something heavier had just been brought in. I set the map down slowly, the paper making a soft scrape against the table, and walked back toward the door. Because if Rebecca believed she had already won by moving a fence, she had not looked closely enough at where she decided to build. The air outside felt different now, heavier, like something had shifted beneath the surface that only I could see. The machinery had moved closer to the boundary, and the low grind of a diesel engine vibrated through the ground under my boots as I stepped back onto the property. A backhoe sat angled near the flagged line, its bucket resting just inches above the dirt where my land used to extend, the metal edges still coated with fresh soil. A crew of 3 stood nearby, hard hats tilted back, talking over the noise with the casual ease of people who thought they were exactly where they were supposed to be. One of them noticed me and gave a quick nod, not defensive, not cautious, just acknowledging another person on a job site. That told me everything. They had not been warned. They had not been told there was a dispute. To them, this was just another approved project, another measured line already signed off somewhere above their pay grade. I walked toward the nearest survey stake, the bright orange flag snapping lightly in the breeze, and crouched down to look at the marking spray painted into the dirt. The numbers were clean, recent, and wrong. Not wildly wrong, not something obvious enough to raise suspicion at a glance, but off just enough to shift the curve of that entrance into my property by a controlled margin. 6 feet at the narrowest point, closer to 9 where the arc widened. I could almost see the thought process behind it. Small enough to seem insignificant, large enough to make their design work. A compromise they assumed I would accept or never notice. I stood up slowly, brushing the dust from my hands, and turned toward the developing entrance. The wooden forms outlined a wide, sweeping curve meant to guide traffic smoothly into the neighborhood, framed by space for stone pillars and signage that would probably carry the name Willow Ridge Estates in polished metal. It was the kind of design that sold houses, the kind that made people feel like they were entering something exclusive. And it only worked because of where they had drawn that line. Rebecca stood near the Lexus again, speaking with a man in a button-down shirt who held rolled plans under his arm. He looked like a project manager, someone used to coordinating moving parts without questioning the blueprint. She glanced over as I approached, her expression unchanged, still composed, still certain. "Everything looks good out here," she said, as if I had come to confirm her progress. I stopped a few feet from the nearest form, close enough to see the measurements etched into the wood, the angles carefully calculated to match the layout I had seen on that printed plan months ago. "Who signed off on these coordinates?" I asked, keeping my voice even. The man beside her shifted slightly, glancing at Rebecca before answering. "We are working off the latest approved site plan," he said. "Survey team verified the layout earlier this week." Verified. I let that word settle. Verified by who? I wondered, and based on what? Rebecca stepped forward half a pace, inserting herself back into the center of the conversation. "Ethan, I understand this feels sudden," she said, her tone softening just enough to sound reasonable. "But this expansion has been in motion for months. Everything has been reviewed." Reviewed did not mean recorded. Reviewed did not mean correct. It meant someone had looked at it and decided it was acceptable. I turned my attention back to the ground, following the line of stakes as they cut across what I knew to be my land, each one placed with confidence, each one reinforcing a version of reality that only existed because no one had challenged it yet. The backhoe engine revved slightly behind me, a deep mechanical growl that echoed across the open space, and I stepped aside as one of the crew members climbed into the cab, preparing to continue the work. They were not waiting for permission. They were already moving forward. That was the real problem. Not the fence, not the 6 feet, but the momentum. Once concrete was poured, once the entrance was finished, reversing it would not just be difficult, it would be disruptive, expensive, something most people would avoid. And that was exactly what Rebecca was counting on. She was not just moving a boundary. She was setting a deadline. I walked along the edge of the forms, measuring the distance with my eyes, translating what I saw into numbers I knew by memory, comparing it to the lines on my survey map. The difference was consistent, intentional, designed. I could feel it now, that quiet pressure building beneath the calm surface I had been holding on to since this morning. Not anger, not yet, just a clear recognition that this was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a decision. And decisions like this had consequences, whether people planned for them or not. I stopped at the far end of the curve, where the stakes pushed deepest into my side of the line, and looked back toward the house, the fence, and the place where everything used to align the way it should. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of dust and diesel across the property, and for a moment everything felt perfectly still despite the movement around me. Because I knew exactly what they had changed. And more importantly, I knew exactly what they had overlooked. And that was where this really started to matter. I did what most people would have done first, even though I already knew how it would go. I gave them a chance to fix it. Not because I believed they would, but because it mattered that I could say I tried. By mid-afternoon, the sun had burned off the morning haze, and the heat settled over the property like a weight, thick and steady. The smell of diesel had deepened, mixing with the sharper scent of cut lumber as the crew continued shaping the entrance. The curve was becoming more defined now, the forms locked in place, stakes reinforced, everything. Moving forward with the quiet efficiency of a project that had no intention of stopping. I walked back out to the edge of the work zone, the gravel crunching under my boots louder this time, enough to pull a few glances from the crew. Rebecca was still there, still in control, still watching everything unfold like it was already finished in her mind. "We need to stop this," I said, not raising my voice, not stepping closer than I needed to. She turned toward me slowly, like she had expected this moment, but had not rushed it. "Ethan," she replied, her tone calm, almost patient, "the project is already underway." "It is on my property," I said. "The boundary is documented. You moved the fence. That does not change the line." For the first time, the man with the rolled plans shifted his stance more noticeably, his eyes moving between us, sensing something that had not been part of his schedule. Rebecca did not look at him. She kept her focus on me, steady, controlled. "Our survey team verified the adjustments," she said. "If there is a discrepancy, you can submit a formal review with the board." A formal review. I let that sit for a second, the words hanging in the hot air like something rehearsed. "By the time your board reviews anything," I said, gesturing toward the forms, the machinery, the progress already taking shape, "this will be concrete." She did not deny it. That was the part that mattered. She knew exactly how this worked. Momentum first, paperwork later. "The community has approved this expansion," she said, her voice still even, still composed. "We are improving access, increasing property value, and bringing the entrance up to standard. That benefits everyone." Everyone. I looked past her toward the developing curve again, imagining the finished version, the polished stone, the signage, the traffic flowing through a space that had once been mine. "It benefits you," I said quietly. "And it costs me." The crew had slowed slightly, not stopping, but listening in that way people do when they know something important is happening just outside their role. The backhoe idled, its engine rumbling low, like it was waiting for direction. Rebecca finally shifted her weight, one hand resting lightly against her clipboard. "Ethan, I understand this feels personal," she said, softening her tone just enough to make it sound reasonable. "But sometimes individual boundaries need to adapt to larger plans." Adapt. That word landed differently. Not accidental. Not mistaken. Intentional. I nodded once, slow, controlled, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel it. "All right," I said. "Then let us be clear about something." She raised an eyebrow slightly, not defensive, just curious. "You are saying this line is correct," I continued, pointing to the stakes cutting across my land. "You are saying your survey is accurate." "Yes," she said without hesitation. That was what I needed. Not an argument. Not an explanation. Just that. A confirmation. I glanced at the man with the plans again. He looked less certain now, his grip tightening slightly on the rolled paper, like he was starting to understand that he might be standing in the middle of something more complicated than he had been told. "Then you will not have any issue documenting that in writing," I said, turning my attention back to Rebecca. For the first time, there was a pause. Small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Not doubt, not exactly, but calculation. "Our approvals are already documented," she replied carefully. "You can request copies through the proper channels." Proper channels. Always a step removed. Always just enough distance to avoid direct responsibility. I let out a slow breath, feeling the heat press against my skin, the sound of the engine still idling behind me, the entire scene holding its shape like it was waiting for something to shift. "I am asking you directly," I said. "Put it in writing that this line is correct." Another pause. This one slightly longer. She did not say no. She did not say yes either. She just held my gaze, measuring, weighing, deciding how much she needed to commit. And that told me everything I needed to know. Because people who are certain do not hesitate when it comes to putting that certainty on paper. I gave a small nod, more to myself than to her, and stepped back from the edge of the forms. "Finish what you are doing," I said, my voice steady, neutral, giving nothing away. Just make sure you keep your measurements consistent. Rebecca watched me closely, trying to read something in my expression, something that was no longer there. The crew started moving again, the backhoe lowering its bucket, the project continuing like nothing had changed. But something had. Not out there, not yet. Inside the numbers. Inside the lines. Inside the difference between what they believed and what was actually recorded. I turned and walked away, the sound of the machinery fading slightly with each step, replaced by the quieter, more familiar rhythm of my own property. Because if they were going to commit to that line, then I was going to let them build on it. That evening, the light shifted in a way I had always trusted, long shadows stretching across the property, the air cooling just enough to carry the scent of dry grass and distant asphalt. The construction noise had faded to a low hum, then to nothing at all, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the machines ever did. I walked the fence line again, slower this time, counting steps without thinking about it, measuring distances the way my father had taught me when I was young. 32 feet from the oak tree to the first corner post. 17 feet between each section. Every number still lived somewhere in the back of my mind, unchanged, reliable. Except now the line was wrong. The fence stood where it had been moved, straight and clean, pretending to belong there. But the ground told a different story. The old post holes had already started to dry at the edges, shrinking slightly as the moisture left the soil, but they were still visible if you knew where to look. Small depressions, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention, marking where the real boundary had always been. I stopped at one of them and pressed the toe of my boot into the dirt, feeling the difference in density, the way the soil gave just a little more than it should. That was the thing about land. It remembered. Even when people tried to redraw it, the ground itself held on to the truth longer than they expected. I straightened up and looked toward the entrance again. The forms were set now, locked into position, ready for concrete. Wooden stakes reinforced with metal pins, measurements double-checked by someone who believed they were accurate. A thin line of chalk ran along the curve, marking the final edge where the pour would happen. It was precise, clean, completely wrong. Inside the house, the documents were still spread across the table, each page carrying a piece of the story that had been built long before Rebecca ever stepped onto this land. I went back in, the screen door closing behind me with that familiar soft snap, and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle. Then I pulled out the older file, the one I had not needed in years. It was thicker than the others, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, held together by a metal clip that had dulled over time. Original surveys, easement records, county filings that most people never bothered to read all the way through. I set it down and flipped it open carefully, the pages sliding against each other with a dry, deliberate sound. There it was. The original boundary description, written in a way that left no room for interpretation. Bearings, distances, reference points tied to fixed markers that still existed if you knew where to find them. I traced the line again, slower this time, following it past the fence, past the stakes they had placed, and into the area where the new entrance was taking shape. The numbers did not match what I had seen outside. Not even close. I pulled another sheet closer, comparing coordinates, checking angles, running through the calculations in my head the same way I had done on job sites where mistakes cost real money. The difference was not random. It was consistent, almost like someone had shifted the entire layout over by a fixed margin without adjusting the rest of the design. 6 feet at the narrow end. More where the curve widened. Enough to take what they needed without making it obvious. Unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. I leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under me, and let out a slow breath. This was where most people would stop. Call a lawyer. File a complaint. Wait. But I had seen how that played out. Months of delays. Back and forth paperwork. Meanwhile, the entrance would be finished, the concrete cured, the landscaping installed. By the time anything moved forward, the cost of undoing it would be the argument. That was the strategy. Build first. Debate later. I tapped the edge of the map lightly with my finger, thinking through the sequence, not just what had happened, but what they expected to happen next. They expected resistance, but not precision. They expected emotion, not documentation. They expected me to react, not to measure. That was the mistake. Because this was not just about where the fence sat. It was about where everything else sat in relation to it. Roads, access points, utility easements, The kind of details that did not show up in a conversation, but mattered the moment someone started pouring concrete. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out toward the dark outline of the entrance under the fading light. From here, it almost looked finished already, the curve blending into the land like it had always been there. But I could see the misalignment now, the subtle shift that threw everything off if you followed it far enough. And once you saw it, you could not unsee it. I reached for my phone, then stopped, setting it back down on the counter. Not yet. Timing mattered. Let them continue. Let them commit. Let them invest time, money, and certainty into a line that did not belong to them. Because once they did, changing it would not be a request. It would be a correction. I turned away from the window, the last of the daylight slipping across the floor, and closed the folder slowly, the metal clip snapping into place with a quiet, final sound. Because if they were building their entrance on the wrong line, then everything connected to it was about to be wrong too. The next morning came with a different kind of clarity, the kind that settles in after you have already made a decision but have not acted on it yet. The air was cooler, carrying a faint scent of concrete dust even before I stepped outside, and the sound of early engines starting up rolled across the property like a signal that things were about to move forward again. I stood on the porch for a moment, watching the crew arrive one by one, trucks pulling in, doors slamming, voices low and routine. They were not rushing, but they were not hesitating either. This was just another day to them, another step in a process they believed was already approved, already correct. I walked out toward the boundary again, slower than before, not to inspect, but to confirm. The chalk line had been reinforced overnight, brighter now against the packed dirt, and the forms had been tightened, squared, adjusted in small ways that only someone paying close attention would notice. They were preparing to pour. That meant they were confident enough to lock the line in place. That was the moment everything shifted from temporary to permanent. I stopped near the widest part of the curve, where the entrance cut deepest into my side of the boundary, and looked down at the measurements again. 6 feet here, closer to 9, just a few yards ahead. The arc designed to feel smooth to a driver, but calculated in a way that only worked if they kept that extra space. I could see it now as a system, not just a mistake. The road alignment, the drainage slope, the angle of entry from the main road, all of it tied together by that shift. Change one piece, and the rest would have to move with it. That was what they had overlooked. Not the line itself, but what depended on it. A truck backed into position behind me, the steady beep of its reverse alarm cutting through the morning air, and I stepped aside as a worker climbed out and began checking the forms. He carried a tape measure, pulling it taut between 2 points, calling out numbers to another crew member who marked them down without question. I watched the process for a minute, the repetition of it, the quiet confidence that comes from believing your starting point is correct. I had seen it before on job sites where everything looked right until someone checked the original reference and realized the entire project was offset by inches that turned into feet over distance. It never showed up at the beginning. It revealed itself later, when everything was already built. I turned and walked back toward the house, not because I was done, but because I had seen enough for now. Inside, the folder was still where I had left it, the edges of the paper catching the morning light through the window. I opened it again, this time pulling out a different set of documents, the ones most people skipped over because they were harder to read, denser, filled with language that did not feel immediate. Easement agreements, access rights, utility corridors that ran beneath the surface, invisible until someone needed them. I spread them out next to the survey map, aligning edges, matching coordinates, tracing how one document connected to another. And there it was again. The same pattern. The entrance they were building did not just cross my boundary. It intersected with an easement that predated the entire neighborhood. A strip of land reserved for access and infrastructure, recorded decades ago, still active whether anyone remembered it or not. I followed the description carefully, reading each line twice, mapping it out in my head until it aligned with what I had seen outside. The new entrance sat directly across it. Not partially, fully. That changed things. Not just for me, but for every part of that development that relied on that entrance functioning the way they planned. I leaned back slightly, letting the weight of that settle. This was no longer just about a fence or a boundary adjustment. This was about a line that carried legal significance beyond ownership, a line that could not be moved simply because it was inconvenient. I stood up again, the chair scraping lightly against the floor, and walked back to the window. Outside, the crew was finishing their measurements, preparing for the next step, unaware that the ground they were about to pour over carried a restriction they had not accounted for. The sunlight hit the forms at an angle now, casting sharp shadows that made the curve look even more defined, more permanent than it actually was. I could see how it would look when it was finished: smooth concrete, clean edges, a polished entrance that suggested everything had been planned correctly from the beginning. That was the illusion they were building. And illusions only hold as long as no one checks what is underneath. I picked up my phone again, turning it over in my hand, considering who needed to see this first, who would understand the significance without turning it into noise. Because once this moved forward, once the concrete was poured, reversing it would not just be a correction. It would be a disruption that reached further than they expected. I set the phone back down again, not calling yet, not interrupting anything. Let them continue. Let them commit to the line they believed in. Because the more certain they became, the harder it would be to ignore what they had built over. And I wanted them completely certain before that happened. By late afternoon, the site had shifted from preparation to commitment, and you could hear it in the sound alone. The hollow knocks of wood and metal had been replaced by something heavier, more final. Trucks lined up along the access road, their engines idling in staggered rhythm, and the sharp, wet scent of mixed concrete cut through the warm air like a signal that the next phase had already begun. I stood just far enough back to see everything without being part of it, watching as the first load was guided into place, gray and fluid, filling the forms they had measured so carefully. It spread slowly, deliberately, following the curve they had decided was correct, settling into a shape that would soon harden into something far more difficult to undo. The crew moved with precision, boots leaving shallow impressions in the dirt as they worked along the edge, smoothing, adjusting, reinforcing. No hesitation, no doubt. That was what made it so effective. Confidence creates momentum, and momentum makes people stop asking questions. I let them continue for a while, long enough to ensure that this was not a test pour or a temporary adjustment. This was the real thing, the foundation of their entrance. Once this set, everything else would follow: stonework, signage, landscaping, all built on top of this exact alignment. I could see Rebecca near the far side again, speaking with the same project manager, both of them watching the progress with the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing a plan take physical shape. She glanced in my direction once, briefly, then looked away, as if the outcome had already been decided and my presence no longer mattered. That was fine. That was exactly where I needed her to be. I turned and walked back toward the house, the sound of the concrete trucks fading behind me, replaced again by the quieter rhythm of my own space. Inside, the air felt still, almost insulated from what was happening outside, but the documents on the table carried the same weight they had this morning, maybe more now that I had seen the pour begin. I picked up the easement record again, reading it slowly this time, not just for confirmation, but for detail. The language was clear, specific, written in a way that tied the restriction to the land itself, not to ownership, not to current use, but to the physical space defined by those original coordinates. It did not matter who built on it or why. The easement remained. I set it down and pulled the survey closer, aligning the two again, letting the lines overlap in my mind until the picture outside matched the documentation in front of me. It was exact, not approximate, not debatable, exact. I reached for my phone again, but this time I did not hesitate. There was a number I had not used in a while, but I knew it was still active. County Records Office. Not the front desk. Not the general line. A direct contact I had worked with years ago on a drainage project that required precise verification of old easements no one else had bothered to check. The phone rang twice before it was answered, the voice on the other end familiar enough to confirm I had the right person. I kept it simple. Gave my name. Gave the parcel number. Described what was being built and where. There was a pause on the line, not confusion, but recognition. The kind that comes when someone realizes a detail they have seen before is now in the wrong place. That easement is still active, he said after a moment. It was never vacated. I nodded, even though he could not see it. That is what I have, I replied. Another pause, shorter this time. If they are building over it, he continued, that is going to be a problem. Not might be, not could be, is going to be. That was all I needed to hear. I thanked him, ended the call, and set the phone down gently on the counter. Outside, the work continued, the sound of smoothing tools now replacing the initial pour, the surface being finished while it was still workable. Timing. Everything about this came down to timing. They had moved fast to establish their version of the boundary, fast enough that most people would feel like it was already too late to challenge. But they had not moved carefully enough to check what lay beneath that decision. I walked back to the window, watching the curve of wet concrete take shape, the edges sharp, defined, confident. It looked right. That was the problem. It looked right because no one had compared it to what was actually recorded. I could already see the sequence forming in my head, not as a reaction, but as a correction that would follow the same rules they believed. They were operating under documentation, verification, enforcement. Not loud, not rushed, just precise. I turned away from the window again, the light shifting as the sun began to lower, casting longer shadows across the floor, and reached for the folder one more time. Because once that concrete set, they would think the line was permanent. And that was when it would matter most that it was not. The next day did not start with noise. It started with quiet adjustments that only someone paying attention would notice. The concrete had set enough overnight to hold its shape, the surface no longer wet, but still carrying that faint chalky scent that lingered in the air. Workers moved more carefully now, stepping along the edges, inspecting, preparing for the next phase instead of rushing through it. The curve was fully visible, smooth and deliberate, cutting across my land like it had always been there. That was how fast something could become accepted when no one challenged it at the right time. I stood near the fence, just inside the true boundary, watching them work without stepping closer. This was no longer about stopping them. That window had already passed. This was about what came next. Around mid-morning, another vehicle pulled up, not a construction truck this time, but a county-marked pickup, faded white with a small emblem on the door that most people would not recognize unless they had dealt with property records before. The engine idled for a moment before shutting off, and a man stepped out carrying a worn leather folder under his arm. He did not rush. He did not announce himself. He simply looked around, taking in the layout, the entrance, the line of the fence, the stakes that were still visible along the edges. I stayed where I was, letting him see everything before I approached. When I walked over, the gravel shifted under my boots, and he turned slightly, his eyes moving from the concrete to me with the kind of recognition that comes from a phone call that had already set expectations. "Ethan," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, practical. No hesitation. "You were not exaggerating." I nodded once, glancing back toward the entrance. "They poured yesterday." He followed my gaze, studying the curve, the placement, the way it intersected with the land. He did not speak right away. Instead, he opened the folder, flipping through a few pages, cross-checking what he saw in front of him with what was recorded on paper. I watched his expression shift, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes, the kind of reaction that comes when something does not align the way it should. "This easement runs straight through here," he said finally, pointing to a section of the concrete that had already begun to harden into place. "It is not minor either. It is tied to access and infrastructure." I did not respond immediately. I wanted him to say it without influence, without prompting. "They cannot build over this without a formal vacation," he continued, closing the folder halfway, his tone still measured but more certain now. "And there is no record of that happening." Behind us, the crew continued working, unaware of the conversation, focused on their tasks, adjusting forms for the next section, preparing materials like nothing had changed. Rebecca was not far off, speaking with the project manager again, her posture relaxed, confident, still operating under the assumption that everything was proceeding as planned. "What happens now?" I asked, keeping my voice even neutral. He glanced at me, then back at the entrance, weighing the question against what he was seeing. "Now it gets documented," he said. "And once it is documented, it cannot be ignored." That was the difference. Before, it had been a disagreement, a question of boundaries. Now it was something else entirely, something that carried weight beyond opinion. He stepped closer to the edge of the concrete, crouching slightly to examine the alignment, running his fingers just above the surface without touching it, tracing the line in the air like he was mapping it against what he knew to be correct. "They committed to this," he said quietly. "That makes it harder for them, not easier." I could feel the shift in that statement, the inversion of what Rebecca had been counting on. The more they built, the more certain they became, the stronger their position should have been. But that only held true if the foundation was right. If it was not, then every step forward multiplied the problem instead of solving it. He stood up again, brushing a bit of dust from his hand, and looked toward the rest of the site. "I'm going to take measurements," he said. "Official ones." I nodded, stepping back to give him space as he began setting up, pulling out tools that were more precise than anything the crew had been using, referencing fixed points instead of temporary markers. The process was slower, deliberate, each measurement recorded, each angle verified against something that did not move. The crew started to notice. Conversations quieted slightly. A few glances were exchanged. The rhythm of the work changed, just enough to feel it. Rebecca turned eventually, her attention drawn not by me, but by the presence of someone she had not accounted for. Her expression shifted for the first time, not to concern, not yet, but to something closer to awareness. She walked over, heels steady against the packed dirt, her gaze moving from the county vehicle to the man taking measurements, then to me. "What is this?" she asked, her voice still controlled, but sharper now. I did not answer right away. I let her look at the setup, the tools, the process that was already underway. Because by the time she asked that question, it was already too late to stop it. I met her eyes then, calm, steady, the same way I had been from the beginning. "Just making sure everything lines up," I said. And this time, she did not respond immediately. Rebecca did not like variables she could not control, and I could see it in the way her posture shifted just slightly, her shoulders tightening as she watched the county officer move methodically along the edge of the entrance. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting sharp light across the concrete, making every line, every edge, every imperfection visible if you knew where to look. The officer worked without rushing, placing his measuring device at fixed reference points, calling out numbers under his breath as he recorded them, cross-checking each one against the coordinates in his folder. It was a different rhythm from the construction crew, slower, deliberate, grounded in verification rather than progress. Rebecca stepped closer to him, heels pressing into the packed dirt, her voice still controlled but carrying a sharper edge now. "Excuse me," she said. "This is an active construction site. You cannot just walk in and start taking measurements without coordination." The officer did not stop what he was doing. He adjusted the device slightly, confirmed a reading, then stood up straight, turning toward her with the same calm he had shown since he arrived. "County records," he said simply, holding up his identification just long enough to make the point. Following up on a reported easement conflict. The word conflict hung in the air differently than anything that had been said before. It was not personal. It was not emotional. It was official. Rebecca's expression did not change immediately, but there was a pause, a recalibration happening behind her eyes. "There is no conflict," she replied, her tone firm, confident. "This project has been reviewed and approved." Approved. I had heard that word from her before, but here, in this moment, it sounded thinner, less certain. The officer nodded slightly, not agreeing, just acknowledging that she had spoken. "That is what we are verifying," he said, turning back to his work. He crouched again near the widest part of the curve, aligning his measurement with a fixed marker I knew was part of the original survey, not one of the temporary stakes the crew had placed. I watched closely as he took the reading, compared it to the document in his hand, then repeated the process a few feet further along. The pattern was consistent. The numbers did not match what had been built. Rebecca glanced toward the project manager, who shifted uncomfortably, unrolling his plans halfway like he was trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been given. The crew had slowed again, tools in hand, waiting without being told to wait, sensing that something had changed in a way they did not fully understand. "We have a certified survey," Rebecca said, stepping slightly closer, her voice tightening just enough to show the pressure building beneath it. "Our team verified the boundary before construction began." The officer stood up again, dusting his hands lightly, and looked at her with a steady, neutral expression. "Then your certified survey does not match the recorded easement," he said, "because this alignment crosses it by several feet. Several feet, not inches, not a minor discrepancy. Enough to matter. Enough to make the entire entrance sit where it was not supposed to be." Rebecca's jaw set slightly, the first visible sign that her control was being tested. "That is not possible," she said. "We work directly with planning." The officer did not react to that. He simply opened his folder again, turning it toward her just enough to show the document, the lines, the coordinates that had been recorded long before any of this development existed. "Planning does not override recorded easements," he said. "If this was not vacated properly, it remains in effect." I could see the shift ripple outward from that statement. The project manager lowered his plan slightly, looking at the concrete, then back at the officer, as if trying to understand how something so solid could already be wrong. The crew exchanged glances, quiet, uncertain, their movements slowing to a near stop. Even the air felt different now, the earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more aware. Rebecca straightened, pulling herself back into that composed posture, but it took more effort now. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice controlled, but no longer as smooth as it had been earlier. The officer closed his folder halfway, his tone still even, still measured. "I am not suggesting anything," he said. "I am documenting what is already here." That was the difference. Suggestion could be argued. Documentation could not. I stood a few steps back, watching it unfold, not needing to step in, not needing to say anything. The numbers were speaking now. The lines were correcting themselves in a way no conversation could override. Rebecca looked at me then, really looked this time, as if trying to understand what I had done, what I had known, how long I had known it. I held her gaze without changing expression, without giving her anything to read except what was already there. Because this had never been about reacting to what she did. It had always been about letting her commit to it. The officer took one more measurement, longer this time, stretching across the curve, confirming what had already been established. He wrote it down carefully, the pen moving with the same deliberate pace as everything else he had done since arriving. Then he stood, closing the folder completely, the sound of it snapping shut carrying more weight than any raised voice could have. "I will be filing a report," he said, looking between Rebecca and the site. "This will require review." Review. Not optional. Not delayed. Required. Rebecca did not respond right away. The project manager looked at her, waiting for direction that did not come. The crew remained still, caught between continuing and stopping, unsure which would cause more problems. The entrance sat there in the middle of it all, solid, newly formed, and already out of place. I turned slightly, looking along the curve one more time, following it from one end to the other, seeing it now not as a finished piece of work, but as a measurement that did not belong. Because once something is documented as wrong, it does not matter how complete it looks. The shift did not happen all at once. It spread slowly across the site like a change in pressure you could feel before you could explain it. No one gave an order to stop, but the movement that had felt so certain just hours before began to hesitate. Tools stayed in hands longer than they needed to. Conversations dropped into lower tones. The smooth rhythm of construction fractured into pauses that did not belong there. The entrance itself had not changed. The concrete still held its shape, clean and solid, but the confidence behind it had. That was the part people always underestimated. You can build something perfectly and still build it in the wrong place. Rebecca stood near the edge of the newly poured curve, her posture straight, controlled, but the stillness around her was different now. The project manager had stepped a few feet away, phone pressed to his ear, speaking quietly, his voice tight in a way that did not match the calm of earlier. He glanced at the concrete, then back toward Rebecca, then down again, like he was recalculating something that no longer added up. The county officer had already finished his measurements, his equipment packed back into the truck with the same deliberate care he had used when setting it up. He was not rushing to leave, but he was not lingering either. He had done what he came to do. The rest would follow its own process. "We will need to pause additional work on this section," he said finally, not loud, not forceful, just clear enough that everyone within range heard it. The word pause landed heavier than stop would have. Stop could be temporary. Pause suggested something unresolved. Rebecca turned toward him, her expression tightening just enough to show the strain beneath the surface. "You do not have the authority to halt a private development," she said, her tone controlled but no longer smooth. The officer met her gaze without reacting. "I am not halting anything," he replied. "I am documenting an encroachment on an active easement. What happens next is not my decision." That distinction mattered more than anything else he could have said. It meant this was already moving beyond her. The project manager ended his call and walked back toward them, slower now, his earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious. "Rebecca," he said quietly, keeping his voice low but urgent, "we may need to review the survey data again." She did not look at him immediately. Her eyes stayed on the entrance, on the line that had already been poured, like she was trying to force it to align with what she believed it should be. "The survey was verified," she said, but this time there was a slight delay before the words came out, just enough to break the rhythm she had maintained all morning. "Then something does not match," he replied, glancing toward the officer's truck, then back at the concrete. "Because if that easement is where he says it is, this—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The entrance sat there between them, the answer already visible. I stayed where I was, a few steps back, watching the exchange unfold without stepping into it. This was not the moment to argue or explain. This was the moment to let the structure they had built begin to carry the weight of its own mistake. The crew had fully stopped now, tools set down, hands resting on hips, eyes moving between Rebecca, the project manager, and the officer's truck like they were waiting for someone to decide what reality they were supposed to follow. Rebecca finally shifted her stance, turning slightly toward me, her expression sharper now, more direct. "You knew about this," she said. It was not a question. I met her gaze evenly. "I knew where my boundary was," I replied. That was all. No more, no less. The distinction mattered, because this had never been about catching her off guard. It had been about letting her move forward without checking what she assumed she understood. She held my gaze for a second longer, searching for something else, something that would give her control back, but there was nothing to take. The officer climbed into his truck, the engine turning over with a low, steady sound, and pulled away slowly, leaving the site quieter than it had been since the work began. The absence of that official presence did not restore the earlier confidence. If anything, it made the uncertainty more visible. The project manager unfolded his plans fully now, spreading them across the hood of a nearby truck, pointing at lines, tracing measurements, trying to reconcile what was on paper with what was in front of him. "We need to cross-check the original boundary coordinates," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Rebecca stepped closer to the plans, her eyes scanning the layout, following the curve, the angles, the same path I had traced the day before. But now she was seeing it differently, not as a design, but as a question. I turned slightly, looking back toward the fence, the true line still sitting quietly where it had always been, unchanged by any of this. The ground between the fence and the entrance felt wider now, not physically, but in meaning. 6 feet had turned into something much larger. I took a slow breath, the air carrying the fading scent of concrete and dust, and let it out just as steadily. Because once doubt enters a project like this, it does not stay contained to one line. It spreads, touching every measurement, every decision, every assumption that led to that point. And they were just beginning to feel it. The following morning did not bring noise right away. It brought absence, and that was what made it feel heavier than anything that had come before. No engine starting at dawn, no steady rhythm of tools hitting wood or metal, no voices calling out measurements. The site sat still, the curved stretch of concrete catching the early light in a way that made it look complete and untouched, but the silence around it told a different story. I stepped out onto the porch and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle, listening for anything that might suggest they were continuing anyway, pushing forward despite what had been uncovered. There was nothing, just the faint sound of wind moving across the open ground and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. That was the first real sign of impact. Not confrontation, not arguments, just a stop in momentum. By mid-morning, vehicles began to arrive again, but this time they were different. No concrete trucks, no. Heavy equipment lining up to continue the build. Instead, smaller vehicles, white pickups, a couple of SUVs, people stepping out carrying folders, tablets, rolled plans. Conversations started immediately, quieter, tighter, groups forming around the edge of the entrance instead of moving through it. I walked out toward the boundary again, keeping the same distance I had maintained from the beginning, watching as the project manager spread the plans across the hood of a truck, pointing at sections, tracing lines with a pen, explaining something to two men who were clearly not part of the original crew. They nodded, but not in agreement, more like they were following a problem as it unfolded in real time. Rebecca arrived shortly after, the Lexus pulling in with the same controlled precision as before, but the energy around her had changed. She stepped out, closed the door, and paused for a second longer than usual, taking in the scene before moving forward. There was no clipboard this time, no immediate direction. She walked straight to the plans, her gaze moving quickly, absorbing information, adjusting. I could see it now, the shift from control to response. She was no longer setting the pace. She was trying to catch up to it. I moved a few steps closer, close enough to hear without being part of the circle. The alignment is off relative to the recorded easement, one of the men was saying, his finger tracing a line on the plan that did not match the curve in front of us. If this holds, the entire entrance footprint sits partially within restricted access. Rebecca's expression tightened slightly, but she kept her voice steady. We verified this with our survey team, she said. The project manager shook his head, not dismissing her, but unable to support the statement anymore. Then we need to verify it again, he replied. Because this does not match what was just measured. The difference was clear now. Before, everything had been framed as certainty. Now, everything was framed as a question that needed to be answered. The crew stood off to the side, not working, not leaving, just waiting, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty that came from being caught between two versions of the same line. One built in concrete, one recorded in documents that did not move. Rebecca turned slightly, her eyes scanning the entrance again, but this time she was not looking at it as a finished project. She was looking at it as something that might have to change. That was where the real cost began to show. Not in numbers yet, not in formal notices or decisions, but in the realization that what had already been done might not hold. The sunlight hit the curve at a sharper angle now, casting a clean shadow along its edge, making the misalignment more visible if you followed it back to the fence, to the true boundary that had not moved at all. I could see the connection clearly, the way one line contradicted the other, the way they could not both be right at the same time. One of the men stepped back from the plans, looking out across the site, then back down again. If this gets flagged officially, he said, keeping his voice low but direct, you are looking at a required correction. Required. Not optional. Not negotiable. The words settled into the space between them like something that could not be ignored. Rebecca did not respond immediately. She held her position, her gaze steady, but the pause was longer now, heavier. This was no longer about whether the project would continue. It was about what continuing would require. I stepped back slightly, letting the distance return, the same way it had been from the start. Because this was not where I needed to push. This was where they needed to see it for themselves. The entrance sat there, solid, clean, and already under question, the line they had committed to now carrying a weight it was never meant to hold. And as I watched them stand there, plans in hand, eyes moving between paper and ground, I could see the moment settling in, the point where belief gives way to verification. Because once that happens, there is only one direction left for the line to move. 3 days later, the entrance was still there, but it no longer belonged to the story they had been telling. The concrete had cured, the edges had hardened, and the curve still looked exactly the way it was designed to look, smooth, clean, deliberate. But everything around it had changed. No construction noise, no crews moving forward. Just a series of temporary markers placed by the county, small flags, and painted indicators that cut across the entrance in a way that made the misalignment impossible to ignore. I walked the boundary again that morning, the same way I had done every day since this started, boots pressing into the ground that had never moved, following the line that had always been there. The fence still stood where they had shifted it, but now it looked out of place, like it was waiting to be corrected. Beyond it, the entrance sat quiet, no longer a symbol of progress, just a structure caught in the wrong position. A white truck was parked near the curve, different from the earlier ones, with markings that indicated formal inspection rather than development. 2 men stood near the edge of the concrete, reviewing documents, comparing notes, pointing at specific sections where the alignment crossed into the easement. Their voices were low, controlled, but the tone was clear. This was no longer a discussion. It was a process. Rebecca stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her posture still composed but no longer in control. The The clipboard was back in her hand, but it stayed at her side, and used. She listened more than she spoke now, her gaze shifting between the inspectors, the plans, and the entrance itself, as if she was trying to find a version of it that still worked. The project manager stood beside her, quieter than I had ever seen him, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful attention to every word being said. The encroachment is consistent along the curve, one of the inspectors said, tapping the edge of the concrete with the tip of his pen, not touching it, just indicating the line. It is not a minor deviation. The structure sits within the easement boundary. Rebecca nodded slowly, not agreeing, but acknowledging that the statement had been made in a way that could not be dismissed. "What are the options?" she asked, her voice steady but stripped of the certainty it carried before. The inspector closed his folder halfway, looking out across the entrance, then back at her. "The structure has to be brought into compliance," he said. "That means removing or relocating the portion that crosses the easement. Removing or relocating." The words settled into the space like something final, something that carried weight beyond negotiation. I could see it in the way the project manager shifted slightly, in the way the crew, standing further back now, exchanged glances. Without speaking, they understood what that meant. Not just a delay, not just an adjustment, a reversal. Rebecca's eyes moved along the curve again, following it from one end to the other, the same path I had traced days earlier. But now she was seeing it for what it was, not a design, not an improvement, but a miscalculation that had been built into something solid. She turned slightly, her gaze finding me across the distance, holding for a moment longer than before. There was no accusation in it now, no challenge, just a recognition of how this had unfolded. I held her gaze, calm, unchanged, the same way I had from the beginning. Because this had never been about proving her wrong. It had been about letting the line prove itself. The inspectors continued their review, marking sections, documenting positions, each step reinforcing the same conclusion. The entrance did not align with what was recorded, and because of that, it could not stay the way it was. I turned away from the group and walked back toward the fence, the real boundary still running straight and true across the property. I stopped near one of the original post holes, now barely visible, the ground settling back into place where it had been disturbed. The air was quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes after something has been decided, even if the work to correct it has not started yet. I looked out one last time toward the entrance, the curve catching the light, still impressive, still clean, but no longer correct. 6 feet had seemed small when they moved it. Just enough to make their plan work. Just enough to assume it would not matter. But lines do not work that way. They either hold or they do not. And when they do not, everything built on them has to move. I brushed the dust from my hands and stepped back from the boundary, leaving the line exactly where it had always been. Because in the end, I did not have to move anything at all.